Hello and welcome back. I hope you're all well. This is Sam Machel and you are watching part 2 of On Virtual Land, an analytical sightseeing let's play series on video game landscapes and the strange and twisted way they reflect our world. This episode is an interview. I'll be speaking with Auckland-based master world builder Marc Loths. Marc has worked as an environmental artist, an illustrator, and as a cartographer. He's also a friend of mine. We've worked together on the games Brownie Cove Cancelled, Some Excavated Wounds, and the recent Dark Kitchen. Here I'll be talking to him about his incredible experimental game/art project, This Too Shall Pass. We'll talk about map making, data collection, climate change, and what it means to move slowly through vast virtual lands. I hope you enjoy.
Right, so This Too Shall Pass is a very experimental kind of cross between a video game and a performance art piece. The main idea of the game is that it comes on a number of USB keys, each of which has a unique version of the game on it. And those limited keys are distributed across the world to different people on different continents, different countries. And when they plug in the USB and launch the game, it figures out where in the world they are. And it generates the terrain where they currently are inside the game, with the difference being that they start off in the terrain being a barren wasteland that also has its water levels where they are projected to be by 2050. So that means if you were to play the game in, say, the Netherlands, it's quite likely your whole game experience would be underwater. So what we actually do in the game is it's very much a game about exploration, about spending. It's a very slow experience about exploring this wasteland and finding little bits of story, little bits of almost poems all across the world, all across this world, and watching and slowly walking and seeing nature return to this place. In a nutshell, it's a game about watching grass grow.
We're in a really beautiful location here. This version of the game isn't based on the location of the player, right?
Yes, so the version that we're playing here is a special version that I've made available until the 1st of May. So you'll be able to download it until the 1st of May, and all downloaded versions will stop after the 1st of May and stop working as well. So this version samples a variety of locations around New Zealand, and it was made with the intention of showcasing it at the Amaze Festival, Games Festival in Berlin. Unfortunately, with the current pandemic, I'm probably not going to be able to make that trip, so I've decided to instead release a public version of the game that everyone can play, everyone can experience for a limited time, for just about the amount of time that it would be playable in the exhibition as well. So this game is a game that's not necessarily meant to be fun. in the sense that, games would usually be considered to be a fun activity to do. This is more of a game that it holds a space in terms of the experience that I would like you to get from it, in a similar way that you might have a painting, for example, where this is something to be experienced and to kind of make a statement and to just reflect on after playing it. So thematically, the game is very much about the, in one way, about climate change, the climate crisis that we're finding ourselves in. And it's also about the ephemeral nature of life and everything. In one way, the game itself doesn't care if you play it or not, or how far you get. There's not really any feedback in terms of how well you're doing, or if you're succeeding, or if you're doing the right things. It's more about just having you as a player being a passive observer, seeing this world evolve without much of your input.
What are we seeing here on the horizon?
So what we're seeing here is basically nature. A sort of stream of consciousness model of how I, at the time, felt it would make sense to represent the concept of nature in physical form. I find quite a lot of inspiration in the work of Alex Pardee as well, who creates these creatures based on, all sorts of ideas and concepts and feelings, or things like that. I got a nice sunrise going.
Yeah, there's like a day and night cycle in this game.
Yep. So not necessarily based on any real life references in terms of how fast it goes or anything like that. But it's definitely one of the slower, on the slower side of day-night cycles that you would find in games, which really serves to immerse you into space, and also kind of, it makes time disappear. I found, so one day-night cycle takes about I think 20 minutes.
Okay.
Probably more. My maths is a bit rusty right now. 3,000 seconds, I think. So it's quite long, basically. And especially while I was developing this and testing it, I would find myself just like walking around for a bit, and suddenly 2 days in the game have passed, and it's already like about an hour almost. And you don't necessarily feel the time. It's nice.
Really beautiful view there.
What we're looking at is, like a real life replica of a place somewhere in New Zealand. So it'll be interesting to look up where this one is and kind of compare it to the photos as well. Quite a lot of the time you can kind of see some similarities between the place in the game and the place in real life.
How does the terrain generation work then? Where does the data come from?
So the data comes from a service called Mapbox, which is just any just like any sort of mapping service like Google Maps, where you can make a request, and in this case there's a plugin that actually just gives me a bunch of terrain data that I can use to create a physical representation of whatever's place I've specified. So anywhere in the world practically works, except for a couple locations where there's just no data available. The data in this case, I'm not entirely sure where it comes from. It's mostly public repositories of data. So obviously there's a lot of places where you can just get geographical survey data. So most of this is actually like publicly open.
I don't think you've mentioned yet the Twitter component of the game yet.
Oh yes, because it's the whole release structure and everything around the game is quite unusual and quite complicated to explain on a single train of thought. So the game also comes with a Twitter bot, basically, that is connected to every instance of the game. So it's one Twitter account at a fleeting world, which when you later on, you might be able to see it over there, that little faint circle of light, will give us the ability to take a photo in the world. And every time that any player takes a photo in this world, it gets posted on the A Fleeting World Twitter account, together with where in the world this picture was taken. So in terms of a latitude longitude value. I thought about it in of course, a couple of different ways. One of them, the issue of, the game broadcasting your location, which is a very major breach of privacy. So the concession I've made here is that the location is quite inaccurate. So it can be off by, I think the most I've seen it being off by is about 80 kilometers, which is certainly enough to, not be able to figure out who exactly posted and where. So this is more on like a sort of secular point of view. In terms of the more conceptual point of view of the invasion of privacy, of this game basically taking your surroundings and presenting them to you in a digital way, I feel is very confronting. And that's, the whole intention of this. I want this game to be confronting, with, just the whole experience of this place being there where you are, the water levels being dramatically higher than they are in real life, and the landmarks being there for you to be able to recognize that. Everything about this game is quite drastic and quite stark. So the fact that it kind of oversteps its boundaries to you as, just a digital artifact that suddenly knows quite a lot about you without you ever giving up any information, serves to kind of like deepen that experience of just a subtle discomfort. So these monoliths that have popped up after we interacted with nature, each represent sort of the sins of humanity, so to speak. So each of those is personified through a character similar to the way the inspiration for this was actually in Alejandro Jodorowsky's The Holy Mountain, where there are a number of characters that are based on the planets and how they destroy their world. It's quite similar in this way, where each of these monoliths represents a character based on things that are destroying our world.
There's there seems an effort to somewhat distance the reality of the things you're talking about from the way they're really presented in a kind of obfuscated or like fantastical way in this game. What's your intention there?
So nothing is ever mentioned by name, and that's intentional, because for one, I find for a lot of people sometimes when those things are mentioned by name, they instantly switch off and they instantly feel like they're being preached to, which makes it harder to reach people. Whereas with this approach, my intention is for it to be somewhat mysterious and provoke the viewer to kind of really think about these things and internalize them and sort of form their own conclusion as to what we might be talking about here.
The art style you've chosen to make this game in sort of flattens and reduces the landscape to sort of simple planes of colour. I wonder where this came from, and I wonder what you were trying to do with that.
So a lot of it came from just technical limitations of the fact that the data that I have available to me here is actually quite limited. And so if it was using more traditional, a kind of more traditional style that you would see in video games, it would become very apparent as to what the technical limitations are here, and they would stand out quite a lot. So one thing this does quite well, this art style, is to hide flaws basically, and what computers can and can't do. But it also, I find it quite nice to just kind of simplify it and make it easier on the eyes, because again, it takes about 10 to 12 hours to play through the game, and having a lot of visual noise sort of distracts from the meditative experience that I intend this to be.
And it also really makes you consider just the topological form of the landscape more than you do in a normal video game, I would say.
Absolutely, and it makes all of these things stand out more as well. Like, for example, the statue that we're approaching here. One of the 7 sisters that you can find in this game, who each represent a different virtue of humanity that will basically aid us in the fight against the climate crisis and rebuilding what we're likely going to lose. So now we get the ability to capture memories, which basically translates to taking photos for the Twitter bot. So when we take a photo in here later, when we get to a nice scene, we will be able to see it being posted, which is quite neat.
Do you feel as though you're encouraging players to be tourists?
In a way, but in a way it's also a way of sort of sharing your experience with other people. In the way that you create this new avenue of exploration into the game through sharing those photos, and allowing people to intently appreciate the beauty of what they're looking at as well. Where if you've probably experienced this yourself, taking photos of something and really analyzing the space and really paying attention to the space in order to get a nice photo. So it's another way of just driving your level of intentional observation. There was a situation shortly after the first couple of keys were released where one of the services the game relies on changed a couple of things and how it works, which ended up leading to the game just not working anymore. Which, I don't know, I just found a really interesting sort of thing. And, a game that is about the passing of time and the passing of everything and how nothing can last forever, it would itself quickly be unable to be played due to just the way that our modern life and all of the technology that we build our lives around changes so frequently, and also becomes outdated so frequently and so quickly that this game won't be playable for very long at all.
It's almost as if there's two forms of land that the game is talking about. It's talking about the loss of real physical land through climate change and the loss of virtual land through changing regulations around data collection, perhaps?
Yes, and just, bit rot in general. It takes one person to change a single letter in a function on a server that serves up the terrain data here, and suddenly the game doesn't work anymore. So, a single one being flipped to a zero practically means that this game is gone forever. And I think it extends to, a lot of other things around it as well. Like, especially now that most of us are spending a lot of time at home inside, we're relying on the internet more than ever. And, I've spent a little while working as a web developer. And if there's one thing that's taught me, it's that the entire internet, our entire way of life that we've kind of built ourselves around, with the internet, is on very shaky ground, and things break all of the time. And, things just disappear from digital memory for, whatever reason, faulty service, all sorts of things like that. Things break easily. And all of this data, all of these things that we now kind of, assume to be just safe in a cloud are suddenly gone and often do disappear.
There's I'm just thinking about this, watching you toggle on the sprint function that is not in the public release of the game. It's just for us, for speeding up the game so that the audience can see a bit more of it. But the game makes you walk very, very slowly, and the landscapes are not one-to-one scale, but larger than they would be rendered in a traditional video game. In traditional video games, there's a focus on making the world revolve around the player and making the player sort of godlike in their ability to traverse the world. So I remember reading something where the sprint function in a game, in a normal game, is more likely, is closer to driving speed in real life, and if humans can't sprint anywhere near as fast as they do in video games. So what's the thinking behind making players walk very slowly?
So even your normal walking speed, if you look at normal games, the character will always like run at speeds that are almost impossible for a human to maintain, even when they're just walking normally. So one of the intentions here with the walking speed was to actually sort of accurately simulate the way that you would walk, the speed at which you would walk in real life. So it's still quite fast if you're going at full speed in the normal version. It's like almost a jog, I think. One of the reasons why I wanted it to be this slow is because I wanted it to feel like you're actually going on a walk. And you're not running when you're going on a hike. You're going slowly, one step after the other, and it's a very, very slow pace at which you're moving, but a consistent pace. And that's kind of the same case here, where you're moving really slowly, which also kind of makes you more intently focus on your surroundings, because obviously there's nothing else going on. So it kind of feeds back into that. With the caveat that what you're seeing here, there's kinds of footsteps that I'm leaving. They are generating paths through the world. So if you're walking on a path, you're actually walking a little bit faster than you would normally.
Okay.
So this kind of allows you to backtrack easier, because there's a lot of backtracking in the game. We have to visit multiple locations quite frequently, just for the fact, to kind of make the player associate with the place a little bit more. Where, in a lot of games, you tend to run through quite fast, rush through the environments, and barely ever, take time to really recognize a place. Well, there are exceptions to this in quite a few games, where, especially with hubs that you return to quite frequently, World of Warcraft's towns being one example. Or I've been playing the remake of Final Fantasy XII recently, and there's quite a few times where you return to the city of Rabanasta, and the more you revisit those places, the more you kind of start to feel at home in them, and the more you start to associate with them as well, where they just become these familiar places rather than just these sets that are backdrops to your actions that you rush through.
It's interesting that that the player leaves paths, and because what you're asking of the player really is to reactivate nature here, as we're seeing slowly plants and grass are coming back to this world, but you're also allowing the player to impact the world in a less overtly positive way. People would perhaps say like that desire paths and paths that have been worn over by footfall of people might take away from a landscape, and
so like part of existing in a place is leaving traces in a place. You can't avoid it. Anywhere where there is human activity, there is traces of human activity, whether that be, more obvious signs like rubbish on the ground or something, or just, footsteps or trampled grass. So I wanted to kind of have the player as a sort of mild force of disturbance in this world as well, where the more they explore, the more they almost harm the place. Where if you walk through flowers and walk through grass, you're actually trampling the grass as well. Which also comes in quite interesting when, in combination with the photo mode, because, you're kind of going to this place and wanting to take a nice photo, moving around to get a nice view of something, trying to find the right angle, and suddenly you've left these huge scars across the landscape of your footsteps.
Can you talk about your experience working as a cartographer and how that has come into your work as an environmental artist, making 3D virtual worlds rather than 2D virtual worlds?
All right, so I was kind of like setting up a little side gig as a cartographer for a little while, where it was usually sort of fantasy cartography, fictional worlds. A couple of maps I did were on real life locations as well. And especially when you're world building and, just creating maps of places that don't exist, you want them to be believable. So it led me to learn quite a lot about geography, geological processes, kind of like how do mountains actually come to be, like why do hills look the way that hills look, why are there forests in certain places and not in other places, so kind of a lot of that stuff. And that kind of fueled a very deep fascination with just the environment at large and kind of the places that we find ourselves in, where it kind of gave me a perspective, a more holistic perspective on my surroundings and kind of, like places in general, where you would think of a place as, somewhere to be, and it's just like, there's like the city, and then there's my home, and there's these two separate places, and then there's like, maybe this place where I went for a holiday 2 years ago, and that's a completely separate place in my mind as well. Where when you're working on cartography and when you're making maps, what it really shows you is that, like, no, it's not actually the case. Like, they're not separate places. They're completely connected, and you can't really separate one place from the other because they're all in this same environment together, and they all share kind of the same air and like the same planet that they're on. So it's very interesting to see, like when you see photos of high quote unquote productivity places, like parts of China or parts of Europe, parts of the US, where there is all the smog and like these big clouds of pollution, and you start to not see it as a place that's off somewhere else, but rather as like a place that's really a part of the space that I and you and all of us inhabit. I mean, there's no better way to illustrate that than a small virus popping up in faraway China, and now suddenly the whole world being completely upended.
Yeah, it's like we're surrounded by so many abstract things that rarely materialize in such visceral ways, and yeah, totally. I wonder if also this game is also almost like a sort of intermediary process between the abstract concept of data collection, and a map is almost like that too. It's like the intermediary object between the abstract thing and the understanding or the experience. I don't know if that's...
Yeah, definitely. Like I kind of see this game being, in a way, similar to a map as well, because even though it's not, in the traditional way, it's a top-down view of a large place with your rivers drawn in and your cities drawn in and all of that, it is a medium through which you can experience a world in a more holistic sense where you wouldn't in real life. Like, sure, like I could, well, if I wasn't in, if the country wasn't in complete lockdown, I could just, jump in a car and drive to wherever this is and walk this entire distance and, explore this entire space. But in real life, there are limitations to that. One of them is I'm probably not fit enough to walk all of this at the speed that I'm walking it. But also, like most of our surroundings are just carved up and divided up into private properties where there's fences all over the place and the landscape is crossed by roads, and it's all very limiting in the sense of, just like how much you can actually physically explore, where you probably don't want to end up on someone's private property and getting chased off it and then having to cross a motorway somewhere. And, there's all these limitations that we've created to kind of separate us from our surroundings.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for your time, Mark. This has been really great, and it's so great to watch this game and to be a part of this game. I feel like playing this game is almost an experience in itself, so thank you.
You're welcome. It's been fun.